I'm Paul Power, CEO of the Refugee Council of Australia. As we look back on 40 years of the Refugee Council, one of the most significant developments has been a substantial rethinking of how the voice of lived experience is viewed in advocacy on refugee issues. When I joined the Council in 2006, it was surprising to see how few of the prominent voices on refugee policy in Australia were people who had been refugees themselves. It seemed to me and to my colleagues at the Refugee Council that as a national umbrella body, our organisation had a responsibility to try to do something about this. When I attended UNHCR's Global NGO consultations in Geneva for the first time in 2006, I was surprised to see that out of more than 300 delegates, there was just one person speaking from a refugee perspective, Tene Kapaka from the Australian National Committee on Refugee Women. As the Centre for Refugee Research at the University of New South Wales had supported refugee women delegates in previous years, we decided to connect with Dr. Eileen Pittaway and her team to try to do something about this. So from 2007, we began actively working with the University of New South Wales to support refugee community delegates from Australia to participate in UNHCR's global meetings. And in that year, 2007, 5 refugee representatives from Australia, including Dr. Malika Sheikh El-Din, participated in the NGO consultations in Geneva, taking forward issues collected through a national community consultation process. And it was immediately clear to me that people who spoke about refugee situations from direct experience, who were personally connected to people still in protracted situations, and who understood the cultural and political context, had a depth and credibility to their advocacy that I could never replicate. So the access which the Refugee Council could provide to senior UNHCR officials and the knowledge and credibility of refugee diaspora members was an ideal combination for advocacy. Each year since then, we have worked with other Australian organisations to support refugee representatives from Australia to participate in key international meetings with UNHCR. In 2012, Australia chaired the International Dialogue on Refugee Resettlement, and the Refugee Council of Australia worked closely with the Australian Department of Immigration on planning of the meetings. We pushed for a global working group on resettlement meeting to be held in Melbourne, just the second time such a meeting had been held outside of Geneva, and also pushed for refugee community delegates to be included in this meeting. Those delegates had such a positive role in discussions that our proposal to include refugee representatives in all future annual consultations on resettlement was supported and adopted and still remains in place today. In 2013, we launched our face-to-face community education program to take the personal stories of refugees to Australian classrooms, to community organisations and to workplaces. Maya Kranic, who is now on our board and was a refugee from Hungary as a child, helped us in the preparation of speakers, assisting them to communicate effectively while managing the need for self-care in sharing aspects of often confronting personal stories. We worked with community members in Victoria and with Starts in New South Wales also to bring community members together to explore how they could work together on state, national and international advocacy. And these meetings ultimately led to the formation of independent refugee community advocacy networks in both states, in New South Wales and Victoria, in 2016. The following year, we were able to convince the Department of Home Affairs to include a representative from these two networks and also one from the Australian National Committee on Refugee Women in the government's half-yearly NGO dialogue on refugee issues. For the first time in nearly 20 years of formal government NGO dialogue on refugee issues, refugee representatives were present at the table. In 2017, we held the first of our recent series of annual conferences, Refugee Alternatives, with a specific goal of shifting the dialogue on refugee policy to enable people with lived experience of forced displacement to frame and to shape the discussions. 40% of the presenters in our 2017 conference were people of lived experience, but this has grown since then, year by year, to 70% of presenters with lived experience in our 2021 conference in July. This has resulted in a discussion which is much more energetic, much more positive, and much more confronting, where the issues which matter to people who've been forcibly displaced are given priority over those which politicians and researchers generally focus on. Also in 2017, we worked with Atem, Najiba Wazir-Firdost, Tabitha Chepkwony, Arash Boardbar and others to hold a side meeting during the UNHCR NGO consultations in Geneva on the future of refugee representation. Out of that meeting came the idea of holding a larger gathering of refugee representatives in Geneva the following year. And we worked for a year with a Geneva-based NGO called Independent Diplomat and with 8 refugee representatives from 6 continents to plan the Global Summit of Refugees in June 2018. This saw 72 refugee representatives from 27 countries come together for 2 days at Geneva Press Club. This event led to the first Asia-Pacific Summit of Refugees 4 months later, which the Refugee Council of Australia helped to organise, and the formation of the Global Refugee-led Network and the Asia-Pacific Network of Refugees in early 2019. Also in 2019, a discussion held at our Refugee Alternatives Conference in Adelaide about refugee representation at the national level led to the formation of a working group coordinated by Shakufa Tahiri to plan the development of a national network. Early last year, at the 2020 Refugee Alternatives Conference in Brisbane, the National Refugee-Led Advisory and Advocacy Group, or NRAG, was launched. We now work in close partnership with NRAG and the Asia-Pacific Network of Refugees on national and Asia-Pacific refugee issues. Over 15 years, we at the Refugee Council of Australia have learned so much from Australians of refugee background. Our advocacy has changed to one based on allyship and partnership with refugee-led organisations. Our board and staff team is now much more diverse, and our organisation, for the first time, is led by a new president of refugee background herself, Yasmina Baraktarovich-Haywood. Some of the many people who have shared in this story will speak about their experiences.
Hi, I'm Samah and I'm the project officer for the Community Engagement Program with RCOA. I first got involved with RCOA in 2020 when I had just arrived with my family from Iraq as a refugee on a humanitarian visa, and I told my story of resettlement and shared that journey in various platforms, schools, organizations, and corporate platforms. And that journey taught me a lot about what advocacy looks like and moved me away from traditional forms of activism in Australia and introduced me to storytelling not only as a healing approach to my journey, but also as a tool for advocacy that I didn't know about before. My involvement with RCOA this year was in organizing and planning the Refugee Alternatives Conference. The conference was a learning experience as well. It was a platform for change that I had never witnessed before. It brought people with lived experience and expertise who led the conversations, who came from all around the world and all around Australia and shared what policies for refugees and asylum seekers could look like. The conference allowed for people with lived experience to lead those conversations, to be co-authors of policies and processes and systems that work for our community because we know better what works for us. So that was an inspiring journey for me. The key themes that emerged from the conference were the need to move away from homogenous perspectives on what refugees look like and who refugees are. So moving away from the victim language and making sure that we're engaging with the community in a way that's empowering. And one of the themes that emerged for me was the conversation of cultural safety and what that looks like in practice, whether that's through ethical guidelines that organizations and corporations can implement when engaging individuals with lived expertise, or looking and reflecting at our own policies. One of the best examples of that was in the planning of the conference this year. We built a policy around compensating people with lived experience with no exceptions, no negotiations, engaging with them as cultural consultants, and making sure that they're compensated for their time and their efforts, and they know that they're valued and respected. So that was for me a process that embodied this principle and that ensured cultural safety, collaboration, and equal power relationships between us and people with lived experience and expertise. You can read more about the emerging themes that came out of this year's conference in the outcomes report, which we will be launching in this meeting.
Hi, my name is Youhana. I'm a former refugee from Iraq. I came to Australia through the humanitarian program in 2006, and since then I started to figure out my settlement. Around 2008, I started to be relevant to the refugee sector. I worked with the AIMS Australia at that time, late 2008, as a community guide. In 2010 was the first time ever I was given a chance to speak on behalf of the team, and that was at the Refugee Conference in Sydney. I spoke about the role of the community guides and how can we work together with the newly arrived communities, and I met there the Refugee Council of Australia, people from the agency. Then after, the connection started, but later on in 2012 there was OSCO HSS conference in Melbourne. That was the real platform for me to meet with CEOs, with senior managers, and to tell them how can I be the voice probably for the refugees. At that time I totally had no idea what does the word of advocacy means, or how can we utilize it. I was given an opportunity, to be honest, through mentoring and coaching with people around me, and I really appreciate all the people that were part of my journey to be able to be the voice of the refugees. In 2013 onward, I was part of the refugees representations from Australia, together with the NGOs from Australia, to travel to Geneva and speak on an annual level with the NGOs, with the UNHCR, and to see how can we be part of the solutions and discussions for the global refugee crisis. Later on, I was able to be also speaking at the annual tripartite consultations, and also recently in the last 2 years I've been very involved with the annual tripartite consultation on resettlement as a refugee voice, as a refugee representation, as a person who's able to amplify that. One of the things I would like to mention here, Refugee Council of Australia maybe gave me inspiration to not only be the representation, because being representative is not enough. You need to validate that. And through my connections and inspirations that I received from the Refugee Council of Australia, it helped me to think about how can I be more effective in that role. And I made a decision, with the support of people within RCOA, to travel back to refugee camps in Middle East. And the recent one was in 2019, when I was given the connections on the ground from Lebanon on who can I meet and where can I do things in the field. This validations of refugee journey is very important for us to be there. I think the role of the Refugee Council of Australia has been very influential for me as a person to be the real voice for the people who don't have a voice. Thank you, RCOA. Well done.
Hi, my name is Deena Yako, and I am the Director of the Community Engagement Team at the Refugee Council of Australia. The Refugee Council of Australia advocates on issues relating to refugee protection at both a national and an international level. The knowledge, connections and experiences of refugee diasporas in Australia can make them the most effective advocates, providing a voice for refugees that may not otherwise be able to access decision makers. For many years now, the Refugee Council has worked alongside refugee communities and advocates to ensure we hold true to our commitment to be led by the people with the lived experience in all of our advocacy. My involvement with the Refugee Council of Australia started back in 2010 when I was given the opportunity to attend the NGO consultations in Geneva, representing refugee community voices. The aim was to amplify the voices of people with lived experience and pave the way for refugees to self-represent. Soon after, I became interested in the work of advocacy and how I as an individual can be empowered to make a change. Through discussions about the various issues refugees face upon settlement, but also highlighting their resilience and contributions in the country of resettlement, I had the opportunity to speak about Australia's humanitarian program and highlighted some of the fantastic work that was being done at the grassroots levels with refugee communities for their own communities. In 2012, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from 2005 to 2015, visited Fairfield High School and its Parents Cafe, a school-based program that supported newly arrived refugee parents and children, where he declared this service an example of global best practice in supporting refugee students and parents as they adjust to life in a new country. Soon after, I joined the Refugee Council's face-to-face program as a refugee representative. I worked with the team at the Refugee Council of Australia and participated in numerous speaking engagements with schools, universities, and both government and non-government institutions. Since the establishment of the face-to-face program in 2014, the program has reached out to thousands of students, their peers and their community through a broader strategy of promoting education on social justice, peace and human rights to the Australian community. The aim of the program is to promote social cohesion by addressing negative perceptions and raising public awareness about refugees, their journeys and their contributions to Australia. This experience allowed me to self-represent my story, my journey, in all forms and on various platforms. I am proud to say that I have been part of this journey where the Refugee Council of Australia has created a platform that encourages collaboration with people who have the lived experience, as well as refugee-led community organisations. Collaborations can be empowering and encouraging for community members who desire to participate in positive change in their own community. The Refugee Council of Australia has played a major role in ensuring that this occurs. I am delighted to say that today we continue to work alongside the refugee community and provide an opportunity for members to be part of our story.